She was 19 years old, scrubbing lamp covers in the parking lot of an apartment complex on a Monday morning in late May. The sun was already warm, the air still, the kind of slow college town quiet you get when most of the student population has cleared out for summer. Her sister had stepped away for a few minutes to run an errand, but when she came back, the bucket was still on the asphalt. The flip-flop sandals were still there too, sitting near the curb the way you'd leave them if you meant to come right back. Brooke Wilberger was gone, and within the hour, every promising lead in her case would feed into a question Oregon investigators couldn't answer for the next 5 years. Brooke grew up in Veneta, a small town tucked into the timber country west of Eugene. Her father worked as a process engineer at a chemical plant, and her mother taught school. She was one of several Wilberger kids, and she'd just finished her freshman year at Brigham Young University in Utah by May of 2004. She was back in Oregon for the summer, picking up paying work where she could find it. Her older sister Stephanie and Stephanie's husband were managing an apartment complex in Corvallis. They had a job ready for her, cleaning the breezeways, scrubbing the light fixtures, and tidying up the grounds. It was supposed to be a couple of weeks of easy outdoor work before she went back to school. The morning started at the apartment Stephanie shared with her husband, where Brooke had stayed the night before. She got up early, walked over to the Oak Park Apartments in southwest Corvallis, and got to work in the parking lot with a step stool and cleaning supplies. The complex sat in a residential pocket near Oregon State University. Most of the student population had already cleared out for the term, so foot traffic was minimal. It wasn't the kind of place a predator would pick if he were planning an abduction with no witnesses, but it wasn't far off a main road. Unfortunately, most of the apartment windows looked the wrong direction to see the back corner of the lot. Around 11 in the morning, a man called 911 to report a green minivan being driven recklessly on a road just south of Corvallis. The driver was weaving and speeding, and the caller gave only a first name, Brian, before hanging up. Detectives would eventually try to get Brian to come forward to get more information about what he had seen, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That report was logged and largely forgotten, and it would take more than a year before anyone in the investigation understood what they'd been looking at. For now, keep this call in mind, because we'll be coming back to it shortly, since it's one of the clues that would break this case wide open. Stephanie came back from her errand a little after 11, and the cleaning supplies were where Brooke had left them. Brooke's wallet and purse was still back in the apartment, as was her apartment. Stephanie looked around and found that Brooke's car was also still parked in the area. The only thing missing was Brooke herself. Corvallis police treated the Brooks case as an abduction almost immediately, despite Stephanie having been gone only about 20 minutes. Brooke was a careful young woman with no history of running off, no boyfriend trouble, no issues of any kind. There were no signs of unhappiness in any of the people who knew her well, and by the afternoon, dozens of officers were searching. By the next morning, hundreds of volunteers were combing fields, parking structures, drainage ditches, and the wooded slopes that ring the Willamette Valley. The Wilbergers gave interviews on every camera they could find, and they built a website, set up a tip line, and flew between Oregon and Utah, meeting with anyone who could help. The story climbed from local news to regional news to national news, and America's Most Wanted ran a segment on her case. Investigators worked through the obvious suspects, hoping to find a boyfriend or ex-boyfriend who was responsible. It turned out that Brooke had only had one boyfriend ever, and at the time the abduction occurred, he was in Venezuela on a Mormon missionary trip. Every lead that detectives pursued soon went cold, as did the case itself. The break didn't come from Oregon, rather it came from a parking lot in New Mexico, roughly 1,500 miles south, in late November of 2004. A young woman who'd come to the University of New Mexico on an exchange program from Russia was walking back to her car in Albuquerque. A man approached her with a knife and forced her into a red Honda. He drove her to a deserted lot, bound her hands with a scarf and her ankles with a shoelace, and assaulted her in the back of the car. At some point, he stepped outside the vehicle, and she wriggled her hands free, then her ankles, opened the door, and ran for her life. She made it, and Albuquerque detectives picked up the suspect within days. His name was Joel Courtney, and he was 38, married, a father of 3, and had grown up in Beaverton, Oregon. He had previously pled guilty to a variety of disgusting charges in Oregon's Washington County back in 1985, when he was 19. He had served prison time for it, and also served more time after subsequent probation violations. After his release in the mid-1990s, he'd cycled through manual labor jobs across multiple states, with his new family following along. By the spring of 2004, he was working as a supervisor for a Portland-area construction cleaning company. A routine background check by an Albuquerque investigator turned up something that couldn't be ignored. Courtney had been bouncing between Oregon and the Southwest for months, and his name had never come up in the Wilberger file. The detective in New Mexico picked up a phone and called Corvallis. Oregon investigators pulled Courtney's employment records, fuel receipts, vehicle assignments, and route logs. On May 24, 2004, the day Brooke was taken, Joel Courtney had been driving a company vehicle. It was a green 1997 Dodge Caravan, and he had taken it from Portland to the Oregon coast on a service run for his employer. His route ran straight through Corvallis, and his timing put him in the area at the exact window in which Brooke disappeared. The 911 call from the man who'd called himself Brian, dismissed at the time as a routine reckless driving call, suddenly looked very different. Unfortunately, Brian couldn't be located, but his emergency call, along with all the other evidence, was enough to get cops to make a move. Oregon charged Courtney with the abduction and aggravated slaying of Brooke Wilberger in 2005. New Mexico had him first and prosecuted him there for the Albuquerque attack, which led to significant delays in Brooke's case. In 2007, Courtney was convicted of kidnapping and other vile offenses in New Mexico and sentenced to 18 years. Then he was extradited to Oregon to face the Wilberger charges, and from there the evidence kept accumulating. Forensic technicians went over the green Caravan, which was still in the possession of his employer. Witnesses came forward who'd seen a green minivan in or near the Oak Park lot that morning. Investigators reconstructed Courtney's route on May 24th, mile by mile, and tied his presence to the complex. They had no body, no eyewitness to the abduction itself, and no confession. What they had was the kind of circumstantial mosaic that's almost airtight when you step back and look at the whole picture. But circumstantial cases like this can be picked apart by defense attorneys who can target elements of the circumstantial mosaic. If even one single tile of the mosaic comes off, then the entire picture can look completely different. This is especially true given that the prosecution needs to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. To make matters more complex, prosecutors signaled they'd be seeking the death penalty, despite the fact no body had been located. Courtney's defense team filed motion after motion, challenging searches, challenging the venue, challenging every line of the indictment they could plausibly question. Years went by, and the Wilbergers attended hearings in Corvallis and watched the calendar turn. By the summer of 2009, the case had technically been moving through Oregon courts for nearly half a decade. Brooke had been gone for 5 years, and her parents had still never been allowed to bury her because no one outside of Joel Courtney knew where she was. The Oregon attorneys understood the trap they were in and understood that they had not only a duty to public safety, but to Brooke's family as well. They had enough evidence to convict, almost certainly, but a verdict without remains would mean Brooke would stay missing forever. The family's wish to bring their daughter home pulled the prosecutors in a direction they would not otherwise have gone. In September 2009, attorneys for both sides reached an arrangement. If Courtney would lead investigators to Brooke's remains and plead guilty, the state would take the death penalty off the table and accept a life sentence without parole. The Wilbergers signed off on this arrangement, though technically that wasn't a requirement. On September 19th, Courtney was taken from custody and driven west out of Corvallis into the Oregon Coast Range. The route ran roughly 12 miles into Benton County, then off the main highway. Then they went on to an abandoned logging road climbing through second-growth timber on private land west of town. The terrain was rough, steep, and densely overgrown, the sort of place you'd never find anyone as long as you searched. Courtney directed the search team to a shallow grave on a hillside, and the remains were there exactly where he said they'd be. An autopsy later confirmed that Brooke had been struck repeatedly in the head with a blunt object, which was consistent with the manner of death he admitted to in the plea filings. 2 days later, on September 21st, 2009, Courtney stood up in a Corvallis courtroom and entered his guilty plea. He admitted to driving his green Caravan into the Oak Park lot that May morning. He admitted to positioning the vehicle so that Brooke was screened from the line of sight of the apartment windows. He admitted he'd taken her at knife point, bound her with duct tape, and driven her up into the Coast Range. I'll skip the rest of the details since it's gratuitous, but it's safe to say that Brooke met a fate that absolutely no one deserved. The judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively with the New Mexico sentence. Courtney was processed back into the Oregon Department of Corrections, where he had already served time once before, and he's been rotting there ever since, this time forever. There's a detail about this case that's easy to skip past, and it's the one that bothers me the most. When Joel Courtney attacked the woman in Albuquerque 6 months after taking Brooke, he was driving a different vehicle. He was operating in a different state and using a somewhat different method. By every traditional measure of how investigators connect cases, he was a stranger to the Wilberger file. The reason his name finally surfaced in Oregon wasn't brilliant inferential work in Corvallis or some high-tech forensic breakthrough. It was that one Albuquerque detective who ran a background check, saw an old Oregon conviction, picked up the phone, and asked a question. That one phone call collapsed what would have almost certainly been an unsolved cold case investigation into a charge sheet within weeks. But that brings me back to my point. Courtney had been operating as a working supervisor in a job that took him in and out of small towns at all hours. In the years since the plea, the FBI has flagged Courtney as a possible suspect in other unsolved attacks across the states where his work and family had moved him through. None of those cases have been closed against him, and he hasn't faced any additional charges at this point. He's never volunteered anything beyond what the Wilberger plea required, and he's offered no further admissions in the years since. Personally, I think there's more to Courtney's story, since everything about him indicates that he was a serial predator. Sometime in the early hours of April 12, 2019, a car sat abandoned on one of the busiest bridges in Texas, and the driver's belongings were still inside. Her phone, her purse, all the small things a person carries through an ordinary day were there. The Fred Hartman Bridge stretches almost a mile and a half over the Houston Ship Channel, rising nearly 180 feet above the water. And on this particular night, surveillance cameras caught something strange happening on its deck. A figure stepped out of that car. The figure didn't climb the railing or pause at the edge of the deck. It just walked off the frame and disappeared into the dark, and to this day nobody has been able to confirm who it actually was. The car belonged to a 23-year-old woman named Nicole Markham, and she's never been seen since. Nicole had grown up in and around Baytown, a refinery town squeezed between Houston and Galveston Bay. In the weeks before her car ended up on that bridge, Nicole had been telling people she was scared. She told several different people this, and she took a step that most 23-year-olds don't take casually. She went out and bought herself a weapon because she wanted something close at hand if the people she feared ever showed up. She'd also stopped living at the address most people associated with her. A former roommate would later say Nicole hadn't really been around the place in months. Where she was actually sleeping during that stretch is one of the murkier corners of this story, but the picture is of a young woman moving around and trying to stay below somebody's line of sight. Whatever she was running from in those final weeks, she clearly believed it was real, and she clearly believed it was closing in fast. Then, in the early hours of April 12th, all of that fell into the background of something stranger. The Fred Hartman Bridge is a 4-tower cable-stayed span carrying State Highway 146 across the Houston Ship Channel. It's one of the largest bridges of its kind in the country, and it's also patrolled, lit, and watched by cameras around the clock. The channel underneath it is one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet, and if you leave a car on this bridge, it's going to be noticed, and it's going to be on camera. When investigators sat down to review the surveillance footage from the bridge, they didn't find what you would expect to find at a suspected jumping. There was no figure climbing the railing or hesitating at the edge of the deck, and nothing on the tape looked anything like a person going over the side. What they found instead was a single individual stepping out of the driver's side of Nicole's vehicle and walking away from it on foot. Here's where the story takes a turn that's frustrated her family and supporters for years now. The official response, at least at the outset, treated Nicole's disappearance as if she'd most likely pulled the curtains on herself. The scene on the bridge fit the surface pattern of a young woman, anxious, with a recent history of fear and stress, ending up alone on a structure with a long history of jumpers. But there's a problem with that reading, and it's the same problem that's dogged the case from the start. The footage doesn't show her going over the side, and it shows somebody, potentially not her, walking off the frame on foot. Unfortunately, this surveillance evidence hasn't been released to the public, at least as far as I can tell. I suspect this may be due to the nature of the bridge and national security concerns surrounding this key piece of infrastructure. The official response, by the accounts of the people who pushed hardest for more, never matched the urgency the situation seemed to demand. Critics have pointed out that the kind of intensive water search a presumed jumping would usually trigger didn't seem to happen in this case. There were no divers methodically working the area beneath the deck of the bridge or sonar sweeps of the shipping lane below. In the years since, a public petition has circulated asking Harris County to take a fresh look. Her friends and family have argued persistently and out loud that the available evidence simply doesn't add up. They point to her fears in the months prior, to the firearm she bought because she didn't feel safe, to the unidentified figure in the bridge footage, and to the basic logic that a young woman who's just taken active steps to protect her own life doesn't usually choose to end it a few weeks later. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just dropping a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership to take your support for my channel to the next level. A 19-year-old missionary disappeared from her family's Bronx home one Wednesday morning in the summer of 1909. A short telegram arrived from Washington a few days later, signed in her initials, telling her parents not to worry and that she'll be home soon. 9 days after she vanished, in a locked tenement room above a Chinese restaurant on 8th Avenue, 2 men cut the rope binding a heavy steamer trunk and lifted the lid. The man whose apartment it was had already slipped out of New York City and into one of the largest manhunts the country had ever seen. Elsie Siegel was born in 1889 into one of New York's more visible families. Her grandfather was Franz Siegel, the German-born Union general who didn't have the greatest battlefield record, but could recruit German Americans in droves. Her father Paul lived comfortably, and her mother Anne taught Sunday school for years at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue. That class was aimed specifically at young Chinese men trying to learn English and find their footing in New York. Anne started bringing Elsie along when her daughter was still a teenager, and by 1909 the girl was doing missionary outreach in Chinatown on her own. On June 9, 1909, Elsie left the family's Wadsworth Avenue apartment and didn't come back. Her parents weren't immediately panicked, as she'd recently been spending time with her grandmother in Washington, and trips like that weren't unusual. A few days into her absence, a telegram arrived from the capital. The message was brief and reassuring. She'd be home by the end of the week, no need to worry, signed with her initials and to Paul and Anne. That closed the matter. The trouble was that Elsie hadn't sent it, and by the time the wire reached Wadsworth Avenue, she'd been dead almost a week. A few blocks south of Central Park, at 782 8th Avenue, a man named Sun Lung ran a Chinese food place on the third floor of a 4-story walk-up. Upstairs lived his cousin, a Chinese immigrant who went by several names, but most commonly, William Leon. Sun hadn't seen him in close to a week. On June 18th, worried, he climbed the stairs to bang on his cousin's door, but no one answered. There was something else, though. A smell was coming through the door that he couldn't quite talk himself out of. He walked to the West 47th Street police station and asked an officer to come back with him. Patrolman John Reardon pried the door open, and the room was almost empty. Just a bed and a heavy trunk lashed shut with a rope. When Reardon cut the rope and tried the lid, what was inside pushed it open the rest of the way. Bent double and wrapped in a sheet was a young woman who had clearly been there for many days. She was wearing some jewelry, including a thin gold chain with an initialed pendant and a bracelet engraved with the letters E.L.S. A cousin of Leon's named Joe was tracked down quickly and told detectives Leon's sweetheart had been the granddaughter of General Siegel. He'd seen the pair of them out at the theater together, and a detective rode uptown to the Siegel home. The family's first answer was that Elsie wasn't missing. She was just away visiting the capital. Pressed, they admitted they hadn't actually heard from her in over a week, and Paul was taken to view the body. According to the police account, he looked at the remains and at the jewelry and refused to identify either. Anne was brought in afterward, and she was able to identify both immediately. There was more behind Paul's hesitation than just grief. There was also the matter of his familial reputation on the line. The investigators going through Leon's apartment had already found roughly 35 love letters in Elsie's handwriting, scattered across the floor. They weren't shy letters, and they referred to sacrifices made for him, family she'd risked, devotion she promised wouldn't quit. There were other women's letters mixed in as well, and Leon, as the press would soon notice, didn't lack for correspondence from women, but it was Elsie's that stacked the highest. A few blocks east on Mott Street, a man named Chu Gain managed the Port Arthur restaurant, one of Chinatown's nicer rooms. When detectives brought him in for questioning, Chu Gain made a few admissions of his own. He'd also been seeing Elsie, and he had recent letters from her, in which she called him her one true love, and asked him not to mind that Leon was hanging around. Chu told police he'd been getting anonymous notes threatening both his life and Elsie's if he didn't break off the affair, and he believed Leon had written them. The picture investigators put together looked roughly like this. Elsie had met Leon 4 years earlier. He was running a small Chinese food restaurant called a chop suey place, using the lingo of the time, on Amsterdam Avenue, not far from the Siegel home. Anne Siegel had taken her daughter into Chinese restaurants on missionary rounds, and Leon had become a familiar face. He started sitting with the Siegels at church, visited their home, took mother and daughter on tours of Chinatown. At some point, the friendship became something else, and Leon had even lived briefly under the Siegel roof, though the true nature of the relationship was unknown to her parents. Just over a week before Elsie disappeared, he'd shown up at a police station asking for an officer to accompany him to the family's house. He claimed Anne owed him $300, and he wanted to retrieve his clothes without trouble. By the spring of 1909, Elsie had also taken up with Chu Gain, and Leon eventually figured it out. Witnesses said he showed up drunk to a party at the Siegel home on the evening of June 8th and pulled Elsie aside to warn her that if she kept seeing Chu, he'd cut them both down. The next morning, June 9th, Elsie left home, and instead of going to her grandmother's, she went to 782 8th Avenue. Leon hadn't lived in that apartment alone, and his roommate, a Chinese man named Chong Sing, also vanished on June 9th. A few days after the trunk was found, a man named Harvey Kennedy hired a new Chinese cook from an employment agency on West 29th Street. The next morning, he opened the paper and recognized his new cook in the manhunt photograph. Police picked Chong Sing up. His statements changed repeatedly over the early days of the investigation. The version he eventually settled on was that Elsie had come to the apartment that morning to confront Leon to tell him to stop visiting the family. Chong Sing said he was downstairs when she arrived, then went up and heard a struggle from the next room. Through a partly open door, he claimed to have seen Leon throw Elsie onto the bed and end her life, a fact that struck detectives as odd. Chong Sing, for his part, was a strapping, physically imposing young man, and the idea that he didn't attempt to stop the attack was suspicious at best. He said he walked in afterward, touched her hand, and was told she was already deceased. Then, by his telling, he handed Leon 200 of his own dollars, apparently so that William Leon could escape, and then Chong Sing walked over to the Port Arthur restaurant. Sing convinced Chu Gain that William would leave town for good if he was bankrolled, and Chu emptied the till for $260. For Chu Gain, his motivation for doing this was apparent. He wanted to clear out a romantic rival. Chong Sing brought it back to the apartment and watched Leon put Elsie's body in the trunk. Parts of that story matched what police could verify on their own, but other parts remained mysterious. For instance, the transaction between Chong Sing and Chu Gain could be verified as having actually happened. But what happened next is a bit more bizarre. Within an hour or two of the time Chong Sing claimed the slaying happened, Leon had walked into the Constitution Express Company on 8th Avenue. Leon paid a driver named Arthur Logan to move the trunk uptown to a laundry service, though the reasoning for this move was unclear. Then, that night, he hired a chauffeur to take him and the trunk over to a Chinese restaurant in Newark, where he tried to leave it indefinitely. The Newark man refused, and the trunk made its way back to 782 8th Avenue the following afternoon, and there it sat, in a locked room. It would sit there until Reardon forced the door 8 days later, in the presence of Sun Leung. When the coroner's jury met on September 24th, 1909, it named William Leon as the man responsible for Elsie's death by asphyxiation. Chong Sing, who had been held as a potential collaborator on a $10,000 bond, was released for lack of evidence to charge him. Personally, I find this part a little bit bizarre, since everything indicates that Chong Sing was, at the very least, an accessory after the fact. Anyway, I looked into this offense a bit more, and it existed as a common law offense at the time of the crime, but it wouldn't be codified until 1965 in New York. I suspect the reason he was never charged is that proving the offense beyond a reasonable doubt would be problematic without William Leon's testimony. By then, Leon's face had been on the front page of nearly every major newspaper in North America for 3 months. Police rounded up Chinese men with even a vague resemblance to him from California to the Canadian Maritimes. Steamships bound for Asia were searched cabin by cabin. Reported sightings poured in from Cuba, Texas, the Midwest, the West Coast, even the Far East itself. The telegram from Washington, the one signed with Elsie's initials, was traced to a Chinese man matching Leon's description, who'd handed it in at the wire office on June 11th. However, that said, it remains unclear if this individual was actually Leon or someone else. But as you'll see, detectives of the time didn't consider other possibilities. That was 2 days after Elsie had already been put in the trunk, and investigators came to believe Leon himself had sent the message. They believed that this was partly to buy time and partly to set up a trail leading anywhere but 8th Avenue. The case dominated American newspapers through the summer and into the fall, and a touring show based on the case played theaters across the country. Anne Siegel, by some accounts, suffered a breakdown and underwent experimental psychiatric treatment after coming to believe her own missionary work had led her daughter to that fate. William Leon was never found, and theories rushed in to fill the space he'd left almost immediately. One version had him on a steamship for China, under another name where he lived out his life, never to return to the United States. Another theory said members of a Chinese organized crime group in New York City tracked him down and eliminated him. Under this theory, William Leon had brought an immense amount of police intrusion into Chinatown, and these figures wanted him gone. A third theory, perhaps the most bizarre of all, claimed he'd taken Elsie alive with him, and the body in the trunk belonged to some other woman entirely. Under this theory, he eliminated another woman and put Elsie's jewelry on her, while letting the decomposition make her largely unrecognizable. Notably, while this theory was popular at the time, it was popular because it was lurid, and it moved papers. There was never any evidence to support this, despite numerous questionable press outlets reporting sightings as a front-page news story for the next decade or so. Still another theory claims that William Leon was himself a victim, and that Chong Sing may have been the man who eliminated him. Under this theory, Chu Gain gave the money to Chong Sing not to ensure that William Leon left New York City, but fulfill a hit on the man, eliminating a romantic rival. However, this theory doesn't meaningfully explain why Elsie also perished, since this would run contrary to what Chu Gain wanted. Anyway, all I can say for sure is that I believe that Chong Sing was likely much more involved than he made himself out to be. On a cool October evening in 1983, 19-year-old Patty Osborne stepped out of a Seattle motel and into the neon glow of Aurora Avenue. She told her quote-unquote boyfriend she was heading to meet a man at a nearby restaurant, a quote-unquote date arranged by phone. She never made it to that meeting, and Patty vanished without a trace into the night. In a city already on edge from a string of grisly attacks targeting young women, Patty's disappearance would soon become part of one of the most notorious cases in American history. Patty Osborne's life hadn't been easy to say the least, and she grew up in a very rough household. Born in 1964, she grew up in Washington State, and by her teenage years struggled with substance use and frequent trouble with the law. At just 17, Patty left her family home for good and drifted into life on the streets of Seattle, where she became involved in illicit work to survive. Despite the hardships and risky lifestyle, Patty remained in contact with her mother, Patricia Muse. She never let a holiday or birthday pass without a phone call home, a reassurance that she was still alive and thinking of her family. Concerned and unable to reach her daughter, Patty's family feared the worst as the fall of 1983 dragged on. On October 28th, 1983, Patty was last seen along Seattle's North Aurora Avenue, an area dotted with motels and known strolls for this sort of paid work. She had been staying with a man described as her boyfriend at a motel on North 115th Street in Aurora. That evening, Patty left the motel room to meet a client at a nearby restaurant. The plan was routine for Patty's line of work, but something went terribly wrong. When her boyfriend realized she hadn't come back, and with no word from Patty in the days that followed, it became clear she had mysteriously disappeared. Patty's disappearance didn't happen in isolation, and Seattle was in the grip of fear during late 1983, as dozens of young women were going missing or turning up deceased. Just the previous year, in 1982, police had discovered the bodies of 5 women in or near the Green River in King County, sparking a massive investigation. Throughout 1983, more women connected to the case went missing, and several bodies were found dumped in wooded areas around Seattle's suburbs. Many of the victims, like Patty, were living on the outskirts of life, and were in this illicit line of work, or were young runaways. It was against this backdrop that Patty Osborne vanished, and investigators quickly suspected her case was not a simple missing person, but something far more sinister. Within months of Patty's disappearance, law enforcement added her name to the growing list of women believed to have been slain by the then still unidentified Gary Ridgway. This is a name, of course, that's well known to anyone with even a passing familiarity with crime. The Green River investigation stretched on for years without an arrest. It would go on to become one of the largest and longest-running serial predator cases in American history. Finally, in November 2001, a major breakthrough came when DNA technology linked a longtime suspect, Gary Ridgway, to several of the attacks. Ridgway was arrested and eventually struck a plea bargain to avoid the DP, and he agreed to confess to everything so the authorities could bring closure to the families of the victims. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts, making him one of the most prolific confirmed serial predators in history. As part of his cooperation with authorities, Ridgway provided information on many of his victims, including details that helped recover remains of women long missing. In the course of these interviews, Ridgway also admitted to slaying Patty Osborne. However, unlike most of his other confessions, his admission, lacking detail and physical evidence, wasn't enough for prosecutors to bring a formal charge in Patty's case. With no body and no forensic proof, authorities had to leave Patty Osborne's case officially unsolved, even as Ridgway went to prison for life for the numerous other cases. In the final plea agreement, King County Sheriff officials removed Patty's name from the list of victims Ridgway was charged with, citing the lack of evidence. This, of course, was an awful feeling for Patty's family, who thought that there would be some form of justice for Patty now that Ridgway was clapped in cuffs. At present, most believe that Gary Ridgway was indeed responsible for the slaying of Patty Osborne in 1983. However, there are lingering doubts, because aside from her and 2 other women, he was able to provide great detail on all his crimes and reveal the locations of his victims' bodies. Unfortunately, Patty's body has never been recovered, and the authorities have hoped that Gary Ridgway, who is still alive, may one day sing like a canary. Personally, I believe that he may have simply forgotten the location of her body, since he didn't deny committing this horrible act against her. Notably, he did explicitly deny being connected to a few other victims, who the task force had thought he had slain, so I suspect he wouldn't lie about Patty's case. And actually, as I read that out, that kind of sounds ridiculous. This guy is one of the most prolific predators of all time, so obviously his word isn't worth a thing.